Okay, so in this PowerPoint, I really just chose a few artists' self-portraits to share with you to just show you different ways that we can reveal who we are and to show you like that it goes back to really, the beginning of art, people documenting what they look like or how they felt or who they were. So one artist I chose is Rembrandt. A lot of you may know him for some of his masterpieces, and because he became super famous. He was grew up really poor, but he had quite a talent in art, and he began making some huge commissions and ended up living in a house. You can visit his house in Amsterdam now, and it is a kind of like a museum, and it's all set up just like he had it when he was living. And you can see the studios and the workspaces and the kitchen, everything. I haven't been there in person, but I've seen like virtual tours online, and it's really cool if you've never got to see it. But it looks like a castle, and so we're going to learn a little bit more about him just by looking at some of his self-portraits in his lifetime. And normally artists don't sell their self-portraits. It's something they do to practice, getting better at their skills, because it's a lot less intimidating to draw yourself or paint yourself than just to paint someone else. And you have to realize in the 1600s, this was still before photography. So, they couldn't work from imagery unless it was someone else's work. So from observation, they had to look at the thing and they had to draw it or work from their own sketches. So a lot of self-portraits were really just practice to get better and more comfortable before you move on to other people. But some artists continue to do that, as they go throughout their life, just documenting how much they changed. And that's one of the things I love about Rembrandt's work is this was when he was just a teenager, and you can just see he's kind of in the shadows. His hair's a mess. You can't really tell who he is, and it looks like he's kind of maybe insecure, not really proud, about his, who he is and his appearance. But then a few years later, we see he looks all put together. And so this kind of makes you think of, a lot of us when we're younger, teenagers, we don't know who we are. We don't know what we want to be. We feel like nobody understands us. And it's kind of interesting to see that even back then, that was kind of a similar feeling that we all kind of go through. And then here, obviously, he looks much more confident. There's more color. His face is, much more lit. And you can see he's done his hair, dressed up a little nicer. And it makes you just wonder, maybe his teacher gave him a compliment. Maybe, someone told him he was cute, but like he just looks like he has more meaning or purpose to his life. And then here we see a few years down the road, he almost looks like royalty here. And he did that on purpose. He also looks a little heavier. And that was a sign during this time period. If you were a little heavier, that meant that you were eating better. And so it was a sign of wealth. And we can see he's very proud of all the nice things that he has. And so you can see that he's achieved a lot of success, and he wants people to know that, which, I imagine growing up with some of the hardships that he had, that would be something, class systems were very, prevalent back then. And then here we see this one, just almost 20 years later, and he looks humbled a lot more. In a way, it kind of looks like this one here, but just older. And maybe he's experienced like the harder part of life, and he's kind of become humbled by it. And he definitely had. His wife passed away of illness, and some of his children also passed away of illness. And I think he also realized that just what's most important in life is not the material possessions, but the life that you live and those people that you love. And so I think he kind of, you see that in his expression. And he also went bankrupt twice because he overspent his money, and he lost everything a couple of times. And so that was a struggle that he had. There's even records of him trying to buy like ancient ruins and stuff. Like he was trying to buy artifacts and things that were not something that art is usually bought, but something that royalty, would purchase. So he was definitely kind of irresponsible with his money in that way. But then later in his life, you can see he looks much more kind of jolly, warm. Maybe he was able to finally look back and say, I lived a good life. I'm proud of what I've done. And he was content with, his reputation, which is huge. And then this one, there's different opinions about whether this was made a few months before his death or a few years. I like to think of it as the last one that he did. Notice the composition has flipped. So we see him on the right side instead of the left side. And we also see the palette has changed to be almost just achromatic, like mostly just black and white. So it kind of makes you feel maybe it's a spirit or his legacy. Vincent van Gogh, a lot of you are probably aware, you've probably seen his self-portraits throughout his life. Vincent van Gogh is such a wonderful example to just never give up. He made most of his paintings within the last 10 years of his life. Over 900 paintings and over 1,100 drawings he made in just about 10 years. And so he was super busy and just painting and drawing everything. And a lot of people don't realize that he drew so much. More people are familiar with his paintings. His brother was an art dealer. He had tried to be a preacher, but it did not end well. His father was a preacher, and he got to be a preacher for a little bit in an area that was mostly filled with coal miners, and it was really hard for him because he started helping the people and working in the mines with the people, and the church just thought that was inappropriate. So he started his second passion, which was art. And even having a brother as an art dealer and painting slightly different than everyone else, he was really kind of rejected during his life. Everybody said he was super friendly. They loved getting to know him and working with him. And I think he was just a very sensitive person, just trying to find his way. And luckily his brother and his family helped support him. So he didn't have much. I mean, he lived on old bread and coffee and renting rooms at like hotels and stuff. But he he painted. It allowed him to paint every day, and so that was his job for the most part. But his style of working with really thick impasto brush strokes and little dashes, was more kind of an abstract version of a lot of the stuff the Impressionists were doing. And so it wasn't just something that you saw in museums or galleries at the time. And so most of it, he really never had like a huge exhibit while he was alive. It's reported supposedly that he only sold one painting while he was living. And so he kind of had a hard time, but he never stopped making art. And now you all know his paintings sell for millions of dollars. They're in the biggest museums around the world. So it's kind of ironic, but I think that, whenever you're having a bad day, I always tell myself, well, I still got both my ears and I sold way more than one painting. So I'm doing better than Van Gogh. So I got to keep my positivity and keep going. But his self-portraits are really heartbreaking to me because I feel like they are a cry for help with all the emotional struggles that he faced. We're not sure exactly 100% what all he suffered from, but it was there's a lot of possibilities. He supposedly would eat and drink off of the same plates and cups that he would mix his paints in, and so some believe that he may have had lead poisoning or mercury poisoning from some of the chemicals in the paint, turpentine. He also would drink absinthe and a lot of alcohol, which can cause different psychological disorders and hallucinations and things like that. Absinthe causes hallucinations, and so there's a lot of things. And then some people think he may have been schizophrenic. Some people think he may have had epilepsy. There's a lot of different theories that are out there. Some even believe that he had a disorder called hypergraphia, where people feel the constant need to make marks or scribble. And he wrote hundreds of letters, and also made, you know, thousands of pieces of art in a very short amount of time. So that's very well possible. Also, some even think he may have had undiagnosed syphilis, which if you don't treat it, it becomes it mimics like mental illness, like people in psychosis. So throughout his self-portraits, he often looked like different people. Maybe he was, you know, his appearances changed that much, or he saw himself in a different way. But what I love the most is how emotional his color is. Every painting is a different color scheme, and you feel the emotion, the loneliness, the anger, the uncertainty. It's all in his expression, and I just feel like he's just looking in the mirror, trying to understand himself, hoping that maybe someday people will understand him. And I think that's really the power of the self-portrait, is it's the artist looking at their self. And I think you know, that it can be very powerful, and they capture the audience because of the eye contact that they were making with the mirror when they painted their eyes. And so it feels like we're looking at ourselves. And this one on the left was shortly after the incident with his ear. And you can see he chose to show the viewer the bandaged ear. And, you know, I doubt someone that's eating their paint and living, you know, a kind of messy lifestyle is cleaning his ear and everything properly. And so look at the colors: green, yellow, kind of messy looking, and almost kind of sickly. And they're the colors of infection. And so it almost makes you, to me, I just feel like a throbbing pain in my ear. Like, and it's sad that he showed us this, but then his face almost looks a little happier than some of his other portraits. So it makes me wonder if maybe that physical pain was like a relief from mental anguish that he struggled with. But either way, it's, you know, you can just see the drastic color schemes. This one on the right, the colors feel a lot brighter, a lot cleaner, happier, but yet the blues are so contrasted by this bright orange that we see in his beard and in his hair. And that's because they're complementary colors, blue and orange, and it creates contrast and energy. And I think the contrast is meant to show that even though when he painted this, he was in a hospital getting help, but yet that madness was still kind of trapped in his head, and you can see that kind of pain. I think still is that he feels safe, but like something's still not right. And these were both painted within a year of his passing. So these are just some more artists. I'm probably gonna have to pick it up a little bit to finish in time. But Ever Munch, you all know him for The Scream. A lot of you may not know that this was a self-portrait. He was ill and he was walking home, and supposedly he felt like really disoriented all of a sudden, and that he wasn't sure like what voices he was hearing, but he said he just started hearing a scream, and he looked up at the sky and it blood red. And so it created this iconic ghost-like image. I think we can definitely see influences from like the Scream movie, you know, franchise with the mask and stuff that they use. But you know, I think we've all probably had that moment where we've been sick and standing in line at the grocery store to get medicine, and we just feel all disoriented. And I think he captured that perfectly in a very expressive way. This is probably my favorite painting of Monk, of him in his bedroom, and I love it because I feel like it's such a good portrait of an artist. You can see him standing between a clock and his bed, and look at the clock. There's no hands on it, and so it's almost like time is irrelevant. He also looks like he's kind of dressed nice, but his clothes are all kind of wrinkled. So like maybe he just hasn't changed in a while. And then his bed, it's all made and it doesn't look like it's really been slept in. But then back behind him, you can see into his art studio and you just see paintings everywhere. And then this kind of just exhausted expression in his face. And to me, it makes me think about being an artist, how, you know, we want to rest and take care of ourselves, but no one's going to make your art after you're gone. And so I feel like this is just kind of him showing that like he doesn't know how much time he has, so he's going to keep, being creative. And I know I feel like I'm looking at my own reflection sometimes with this because of the sacrifices we have to make to do those things that we really love. Egon Schiele, he was another artist that kind of lived a different lifestyle, and he passed away very young. He was only 28. Him and his wife both contracted the Spanish flu and died right when his career was about to take off. He was really good friends with Gustav Klimt, who did the famous painting called The Kiss that you've probably all seen before. And Egan seemed to be headed kind of in that direction of fame, but sadly he died fairly young. His childhood was pretty sad. His father, he grew up with his father mostly, and his father died of syphilis, and he had to care for his father as a teenager while his father suffered from this STD that basically mimicked kind of mental illness. And so you can imagine the kind of things that he had to go through dealing with that. So a lot of his self-portraits are his own body contorted in these weird kind of compositions. The skin colors are very unnatural, and his body almost looks kind of sickly. And you almost feel the sense of uncomfortableness in his body, and even missing limbs at times. Salvador Dali, a lot of you may not know this, but a lot of his work throughout his life was also self-expressive or self-portraits, and kind of about his different take on things and around the world. And some say his life was a self-portrait because he was always kind of in this character. And but this famous painting, The Persistence of Memory, with the melting clocks, this was all about like mortality, his ability to reproduce, the kind of societal standards of us needing to reproduce and things like that. And then also stories of his childhood. Apparently, he was really obsessed with watching dead animals rot, and that he would watch the ants like decompose their bodies. And so you can see the ants are crawling on the watches, and this kind of embryotic looking little creature is actually supposed to be him. So you could probably read into it even more. His stuff, there's so much like fantasy in his work that I almost don't want to know the real story because your imagination just kind of takes off when you see it. But several of his, you see that same kind of figure, and also the insects crawling. Rene Magritte is probably one of my favorite, I know I keep saying that, but one of my favorite artists that did self-portraits. He was often known as wearing a bowler hat, and you see him, in his work over and over. And I love his self-portraits and his work in general, just because it's always really simple, but then the content is so, complex. And here we see him standing between a fish and a bird, and it doesn't really, you can't tell if they're underwater or above ground or just in some different realm, but they're all the same size, like they're all animals. And yet you can see how awkward he looks, dressed up in this suit and hat. But it's kind of like, to me, it makes me think of the idea of man and how we're able to, fly, and we've figured out ways to fly and swim, and that we're kind of in the middle between these other kind of worlds that we have and within our world. This famous painting, Son of Man, you can see it's him again, but there's this floating apple. This has been used in so much advertising. You've probably seen it before. But the title, Son of Man, makes you think of Genesis and the Bible and the creation. And that, to me, I feel like so many of us, every day we struggle to try to be successful. And sometimes I think some people try to be something that they're not. And they present this kind of idea of perfection, but we all have flaws, we all have emotions, we all have these things that make us human, and those things are beautiful too. I think some people, because they can't be that perfect, version always, that causes a lot of frustration. And I feel like this painting sort of symbolizes that, because the apple makes you think of like the original sin and temptation. And so here we have this businessman trying to live this perfect, clean, organized life, but then there's this constant reminder of imperfection, or temptation that's in front of us. At least that's my take, on it. This is probably my favorite of all of his pieces, and it's really hard to find a good image of it. I think it may have originally been a drawing, and you can see how the paper was folded, or the canvas was folded. But this is a person, it looks like, I would think the elderly, because they have a cane, and it looks like they've stopped to take a break. And you can see that the body of the person is a bird cage, and there's one bird on the outside perch and one bird on the inside. And the one on the outside is wanting security and playing in the cage, and the one inside is wanting freedom, despite it has, everything it needs inside of the cage. And I think having that be the torso of this figure of him, maybe, is that we all kind of realize that, I think, as we go through life, is that a lot of times when we're younger, maybe we want security. Maybe if you didn't grow up in a house that had, like, a sense of security, where some, want freedom if they lived in a house maybe that was too constricted or controlling. And so a lot of our life is just trying to find out, do we want freedom, which also means, unpredictable things could happen, or do we want a sense of security and things like that? And I just think it captures that sort of idea in such a beautiful visual way. And then Frida Kahlo, pretty much everything that Frida made is a self-portrait. And these are some of her pieces that are my favorite. This one on the left is called Broken Column. And some of you may not be fully aware of her story, but she, there's, if you want to know, like, and be entertained, there's a movie, it's on Netflix, I believe, called Frida, that has Salma Hayek playing Frida Kahlo. It's a wonderful movie. It's the first movie that her family apparently approved of, and said that it was the most accurate depiction kind of what happened throughout her life. But she had a pretty hard life. Her parents were of different ethnic origins. Her father came from Germany, and some sources say he was Jewish and some say he was Hungarian. And then her mother was a native Mexican, with ancestry in like ancient Mayans and Aztecs, and some of those cultures. And so she really had pride in both her parents' backgrounds, and she was worldly learned, with a lot of promise as a young kid. As when she was a child, she also contracted polio, which made one of her legs smaller than the other, and eventually later in her life she had to amputate that foot because of the problems it was causing her. But then when she was a teenager, she was on her way home from, I don't know where she was, I can't remember, but she was traveling, I think maybe on her way home from school on public transportation, and the trolley car collided with another vehicle. And in the crash, several people died, and she broke almost every bone in her body. And one of the handrails stabbed through her abdomen and came out her back. And this caused her to, a lot of people thought she survived, because it pierced her internal organs. It went through her uterus and her spine. And but she was in a full body cast for a long time, and for several years they would have to reset her spine and do all kinds of surgeries. And some said that she would never walk again, but eventually she taught herself to walk and paint. And her mission was to study under Diego Rivera, a very famous Mexican artist, and to start making paintings to repay her family for all the care and medical attention that they had to provide her. And she did just that. And so here we see in this painting called Broken Column, her spine has been replaced by this classical column that's all broken and repaired. We see all of these nails and pins on her body representing all the pain that she feels and nerve damage. But we don't see tears of weakness, but tears of endurance. And we see her topless, not to be sexual, but to show that she is a woman, but she's broken because of the accident. She was never able to bear children. One thing I love about her work is how everything is symbolic. So the background wasn't just a second afterthought. The background is a desert. And desert known for being dry and barren. And so she made that connection with like earth and nature and Mother Earth. And I just love that. This painting on the right, I'm not sure why it's not looking very clear, but this is the one that's called Dos Fridas, and it means two Fridas in Spanish, and you see two of her. This is the more traditional Frida with a healthy heart. In her hand, she's holding a locket with a picture of her husband in it, and we see a bloodline running to this second Frida over here, and here her heart is damaged. She's wearing a European American style wedding dress, and she's clamping that bloodline, but she's still bleeding, and the drips are becoming floral pattern on her dress. It's pretty dark, and we see her heart again is damaged, and she's holding her hand, comforting herself. And I love this painting because I feel like we, in some sense, we all have experienced this in one way or another. We're not always the same person to everyone we're around, or most people aren't. We act, maybe different around our family, maybe to impress them, or when we're dating people or in relationships, sometimes we have to kind of, collaborate and um, learn to live and coexist. And sometimes that means, that sometimes you sacrifice certain things that you do or that make you who you are. And so I think here we see that struggle that she was going through, being herself and being someone for someone else. And I think that there's healthy boundaries, that can be established, but not always in every, relationship. And that's what causes a lot of, conflict within people's families and their personal relationships as well. And that's also symbolic in the sky behind that you see this stormy sky. And so I just think it's just such a beautiful way of capturing that. And in person, it's so much more impressive. And one of the things that I loved is when I was looking at it in the museum, they asked me to step back like 2 or 3 times because I just kept getting closer. But you could see under the heart, you could see the painting of her dress. And so what that made me think is that she painted it natural and then was like, no, it needs something more like me. And so she painted like the heart over everything. And I just love that you could see like that decision that she made to make it more graphic and more, expressive by adding that. These are just some more. I won't tell you her whole life story, but I encourage you, if you're interested in her work, to definitely look at, research her life more. And you may check out that film that I mentioned as well. But there's so many of these. I love this one too. This one wasn't really a self-portrait of her. I think it was meant to be a self-portrait of her husband. But I think, she kind of told her own story, and we all could kind of make a self-portrait like this, but this shows how we're influenced by everything. And so all throughout this creation of this individual, we see all of the things that they learned about and all the things that influenced them, that made them who they are. And we often think of like good people or people that helped us, they become someone that makes us who we are, but we really don't ever give credit, maybe we don't want to those people that had negative impacts on our life. But sometimes those people can make you decide doing what you want to be more than those people that are helping you. And so in this collage of these influences, you see Buddha, you see Jesus, you see Egyptian gods, you see mythological creatures, Mary, Venus, Jesus, Hitler, Napoleon, like you name it, and all these things, Caesar, like all these stories, they all make us who we are. We decide what we take from, those experiences, and whether we want to be like those people or the opposite. So it's kind of an interesting way to think of what makes us who we are. This is another one that's just beautiful. She was sitting in her bathtub and was looking at the reflections and seeing shapes and things in the reflections, and then decided to make a kind of surrealistic looking, almost painting of that reflection in the bathtub. And it really reminds me of the artist Hieronymus Bosch, which some of you may have learned about, who was an early Renaissance painter. And you'll see some similarities to his work in this piece. But you can just see the stuff she was going through. These are her parents that she's trying to impress. Her dress that's kind of been cast aside, and then just like traveling, to America with her husband, and just all these different things that were going on. Here's another one. This is another self-portrait, and so we see. I think this was her or her sister, and then her parents, and then their parents, and then this is the Casa Azul, or the blue house that she grew up, and that's close to Mexico City. But I just thought that was kind of a cool way to make a self-portrait, is through depicting your whole family. Here, for a while, she lived in the United States. Her husband, Diego Rivera, was one of the first, I think he was the first Mexican artist to have a solo exhibit at the Modern Museum of Art in New York City, and he got to paint a huge mural in Rockefeller Building, which is where 30 Rock and some of those TV shows, Saturday Night Live, they're all filmed there. And that time was really hard for her, being away from her family. And so here we see her dress kind of hung out to dry between, all these skyscrapers and this busy American lifestyle. And then I threw in some of my work, not that I see myself anywhere near some of the artists that I mentioned, but I've always felt like I had to hide different aspects of myself. And my art, really, when I started making art in high school, it was really one of the first places that I could kind of be myself and get it out. And then, but not everybody understood it. So it felt kind of safe. And so one of the things I started doing was I would journal. I used to write like a lot of journals, but often I would get rid of them because I was scared of my family, finding them or making fun of me for it. So I started journaling on the background of my canvases and paper, and then I would paint over it so you couldn't read all of it. And then I would combine that with imagery that kind of put together, I think people could kind of get, a feel of some things that were going on. I also started combining imagery and different symbolism, like barcodes, to represent identity, because one, my mom had been married and divorced multiple times throughout my childhood, and two, I'm an identical twin. My twin brother is the complete opposite of me, but based upon society's standards, especially back in the 80s and 90s, he was the more stereotypical kind of teenage boy, where I was into art and other things like that. And so my parents really had a hard time not understanding why I didn't want to do all the hunting and sports and things like that that he did. So a lot of my early work was really kind of discovering, who I was, feeling comfortable with who I was, and making art that reflected that, and also just trying to decide. We come from families, but when you don't really feel like you have anything in common with them, how much of your identity is them? Like, can you be something different? And that's a lot of what I was going through in this time period. This was the first like large painting I made. It was 8 feet by 5 feet, and I built the canvas myself. And one of my uncles has this in his home. But what my idea for this painting was to be more of a self-portrait. And so this was meant to kind of be me up at the top, and where I was living and the stuff I was going through at the time. I just felt like everybody just did what their family did, and nobody really tried to do anything else with their life. And so in my eyes, if you could see closer, there were sheep painted, almost like I was just watching, all these sheep carry on. And for some reason, I couldn't be comfortable with that. So I was going to school. And so here you can see in the background, I was journaling, and then I painted over that some, and then I was taking, I don't even remember what math class at the time, and I just started writing all these mathematical and scientific equations, almost like it was my map to kind of get away from this life. Like school was what's going to take me somewhere else. And then that leads you to the bottom portion where you can see it kind of, looks like a vacation or paradise. And here's a little silhouette of a person. And my fear was, what if I get there and I'm all alone? And that wasn't true. I'm not alone. I'm a teacher and I'm married and all kinds of stuff. And I feel like I kind of created that thing. And so when I look back at this, it's very emotional to think, at that time things were so uncertain. So I think, creating these visualizations of what we want and what we want to do and who we want to be, it can be very powerful. This one I called the Squatting Man or Squatter's Ride or something like that. But I realized nothing I owned, like there was nothing in my family. Shortly after I started going to college, my mom went through, I can't remember what divorce it was, but the farm I grew up that I'd spent like second grade through high school, and it got sold, and everyone was living in trailers or apartments, and my younger siblings, we all got separated, and me and my twin brother just were living in an apartment on our own. And at that point, I just felt like nothing was permanent. And I'm going to school, the jobs that I had, waiting tables, washing dishes, working at, all the different jobs I had, going to school, everything was just kind of temporary for, something maybe better. And so this was just like me kind of expressing the idea that I just feel like I'm always kind of squatting in one place, ready to go to the next, and not knowing, what's going to come of that, or if that will just be the rest of my life. So anyway, a lot of these pieces, a lot of those deal with that kind of identity. And then eventually I started painting these abstract figures because my professor had told me to kind of stop trying to rely on imagery, to show people that I had skill. He said that he thought it was holding me back. So I started just painting these kind of shapes or blobs that kind of look like people. And then I realized like these could be about anyone. And then, in graduate school, I played around with a bunch of different ideas, but I feel like, overall, my work just, continues to be more of a reflection to, what's going on in the world around me, and like how I feel about different things. So a lot of artists are making, self-reflective work.